If you thought the law was lenient on kids, then think again, because it's definitely not. This kid, for instance, got electrocuted in an oversized electric chair. This girl got a life sentence for merely defending herself, and he got a death sentence for killing his friend. In this video, we're going to explore some of the most inhumane sentences ever given to a kid. While some of these kids committed the most brutal crimes, their sentences were even more shocking. Let's dive in. George Stinney Jr. The story of this 14-year-old is one that will leave you shocked and probably traumatized. On March 24, 1944, George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old black boy, and his younger sister Amy were playing outside when two white girls approached them, asking about a specific flower. But since George and Amy did not know where the flowers could be found, they went on their way. However, later that evening, when the girls failed to return home, a search party was organized to locate them. George and his family also reportedly participated in the search, and during the search, George mentioned that he had seen the girls earlier in the day. The next morning, the bodies of the young girls were discovered in a shallow ditch. And guess who was arrested? 14-year-old George. Little George was arrested and charged with murders. Police claimed that he confessed to bludgeoning the two girls to death, even though there was no physical evidence that connected him to the crime. Nevertheless, he was charged with capital murder and rape. A month after his arrest, George went to trial in a segregated courthouse where neither his family nor other African Americans were permitted to enter. His court-appointed attorney, who had no experience with capital cases, also did not call a single witness in George's defense. This meant that the prosecution relied solely on the testimony of a local sheriff who affirmed George's alleged confession. After only 10 minutes into the trial, the jury found George guilty and sentenced him to death. But not just any kind of death by electrocution. Despite George's young age and the lack of evidence, the judge refused to grant clemency, and on June 16, 1944, George was executed in an electric chair. Witnesses from the scene narrated how George, who was just 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 95 pounds, was too small for the adult-sized chair. It was said that the guards struggled to secure him to the chair, and when the executioner flipped the switch, the oversized mask slipped off his face, and witnesses saw tears streaming down the terrified boy's face as the 2,400 volts surged through his body. While George was allegedly innocent of the accused crimes, this next kid got himself in the mess. Lionel Tate. On August 11, 1999, Lionel Tate was found guilty of the murder of Tiffany Unick, a 6-year-old girl. The incident was said to have occurred on July 28, 1999, at Tate's home when he was just 12 years old. According to reports, Tiffany's death resulted from severe injuries inflicted by Lionel, even though the teenager later confessed that it had happened during an attempt to imitate professional wrestling moves that he had seen on television. Despite Lionel's claim that Tiffany's death was accidental, a grand jury indicted him and charged him as an adult with first-degree murder. This conviction made Lionel Tate the youngest person in modern US history to receive a life sentence. Luckily for him, his sentencing raised widespread criticism, with many arguing that such a severe punishment was inappropriate for a child, and so after a series of appeals, his murder conviction was eventually overturned in 2004 by an appeal court. The court concluded that it was unclear if Lionel fully understood the charges against him at the time of his trial. So, as part of a subsequent plea deal, Lionel pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years of probation. However, his legal troubles did not end there. Years later, Lionel faced additional convictions. He was sentenced to 10 and 30 years in prison for violating his probation by possessing a gun and for allegedly robbing a pizza delivery man. While Lionel was fortunate to have his conviction overturned, this next kid wasn't so lucky. Ahmed Manasra. Manasra was an Israeli kid who found himself on the wrong side of the law pretty early in life. In 2015, Ahmed was convicted of the attempted murder of 2 Israelis in a knife attack carried out when he was 13. The teenager was said to have carried out the attack with his 15-year-old cousin Hassan Manasra. The two allegedly stabbed and seriously wounded a 20-year-old man and a 13-year-old boy in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Pisgat Ziv. While Hassan was shot dead by security forces, Ahmed was hit by a car as he fled and was later taken to the hospital for treatment. But obviously, his injuries were not enough reasons to let him go, as he was eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison for the crime. Although his case was later revisited, the Supreme Court only reduced his sentence by 2.5 years, leaving him to serve 9.5 years behind bars. The court also maintained the compensation that Ahmed was to pay to the victims, which were NIS $100,000 to the Jewish teenager and NIS $80,000 to the injured man. The judges claimed they had only reduced Ahmed's sentence because he was a minor, and his part in this incident was secondary to that of his cousin, although they still maintained that his actions were extremely severe. While it's uncertain why Ahmed got into this crime in the first place, this next kid clearly had a reason for the shocking act that landed her behind bars. Cyntoia Brown. Cyntoia Brown was sentenced to life in prison for killing a man who allegedly forced her into prostitution. According to reports, Cyntoia was a victim of child sex trafficking, and she claimed that Johnny Allen, the victim in this case, had paid her $150 to have his way with her. However, during the encounter, she feared for her life and shot him. While Cyntoia claimed that she was the victim, prosecutors argued that she had intentionally killed Allen while he was sleeping. She was eventually convicted of robbing and murdering Allen and was consequently sentenced to life imprisonment at 16. To make matters worse, at the time of her sentencing in 2006, the judge ruled that Cyntoia would not be eligible for parole until she was in her late 60s. Luckily, just when Cyntoia's world seemed to have come crashing down, her case went viral, causing widespread reaction to her sentencing. Unfortunately, in 2019, her life sentence was reduced to 15 years, plus 10 years of supervised parole. Cyntoia was eventually released from prison on August 7, 2019, a decision that the judge claimed came after careful consideration of the tragic and complex case. Just like Cyntoia, this next kid also received a sentence that was widely criticized by legal experts: Michael Fay. In October 1993, Michael Fay, an American teenager living in Singapore since 1992, was arrested and charged with multiple offenses. Authorities accused him of possessing stolen items, including Singapore state flags, road signs, and other signboards. Michael was also charged with vandalizing cars by spray painting them and throwing eggs at vehicles, along with other acts of mischief. In total, he faced 53 charges, including 45 counts of vandalism, 6 counts of mischief, 1 count of retaining stolen property, and 1 count of possessing illegal firecrackers. On February 28, 1994, Michael pleaded guilty in a Singapore district court to 2 counts of vandalism, 2 counts of mischief, and 1 count of possessing stolen property. An additional 16 charges of vandalism and 4 charges of mischief were also considered during sentencing. Finally, on March 3rd, Michael was sentenced to 4 months in jail and 6 strokes of the cane for the vandalism charges, along with a fine of $3,500 for the remaining offenses. Although some of his charges were acquitted, Michael's case still attracted international attention, particularly from the United States, where caning was viewed as an excessively harsh punishment. After his sentencing, the US government made appeals for clemency, and in response, on May 4th, the Singapore government announced a reduction in Michael's caning sentence from 6 strokes to 4. Michael was finally released on June 21, 1994, after serving 83 days in jail. It's said that he departed from Singapore the following day and returned to the United States. While Michael Fay was allowed to return to his normal life after his sentencing, the story was not the same for this next kid, which led him to commit one of the most heinous crimes: Christian Fernandez. At age 13, Christian was accused of murder and sexual abuse. He was charged as an adult with first-degree murder in 2011 for beating to death his 2-year-old half-brother and for sexually abusing his 5-year-old half-brother. Christian's life was clearly not a rosy one. When he was just 2 years old, the young boy was found wandering on a South Florida street, while his mother, 14-year-old at the time, was nowhere to be found. On March 14, 2011, deputies were notified that Christian's baby brother, 2-year-old David, had died at a local hospital. When the boy's body was examined, it was discovered that the toddler had a fractured skull, bruising to his left eye, and a bleeding brain. Christian's mum, Susanna, admitted to investigators that she had left Christian, David, and her other children home alone, and when she returned, she found David unconscious. Susanna also revealed that 2 weeks before David's death, Christian had broken the toddler's leg while wrestling. Christian was eventually apprehended and questioned as a witness. He was also charged with first-degree murder. To make his sentence worse, another felony charge was filed after Christian's 5-year-old half-brother told a psychiatrist that Christian had sexually molested him. The judge's decision to try Christian as an adult drew a lot of public attention, as many argued that children accused of violent crimes are supposed to be charged or convicted as juveniles. Although the sentences given to Christian and every other kid that has been mentioned so far were heavily criticized by experts, these next group of kids met disaster because of their own evil deeds. Peter Woodcock. Peter was a problem child from the very beginning, handed over to the Children's Aid Society by his unmarried teenage mother in 1939 when he was only a month old, although he was later adopted by a couple at the age of 3. Peter's foster parents claimed that he showed signs of abnormality early in life, adding that the young boy was always nervous. They eventually took Peter to the hospital for behavioral problems, and there, the doctor detected schizophrenic tendencies. That was probably the beginning of his disastrous escapades. For 4 months, from September 1940 1956 until January 1957, Peter executed a killing spree fueled by rage and perversion. It's said that his actions shook the whole of Toronto as people were left in fear. These killing sprees made Peter Woodcock Canada's youngest serial killer ever recorded. Once caught, Peter freely admitted responsibility for the killing of 3 children in the 1950s. The 17-year-old even took police on a tour of hidden spots around the city where he'd molested a dozen others. He was eventually sentenced to indefinite psychiatric detention and died in the Penetanguishene Mental Health Center in 2010 at the age of 71. Just like Peter Woodcock, this next kid was also a juvenile serial killer who did some shocking things. Craig Price. Craig Price, known as the Slasher of Warwick, was considered the youngest serial killer in the United States at the time of his crimes. In the late 1980s, his brutal killing spree in Rhode Island shocked the nation and led to significant changes in state laws regarding juvenile offenders. Price, who was a black teenager from a working-class family, began his reign of terror at just 13 years old. His first known murder was the killing of a white woman from his neighborhood whom Price had been spying on for weeks before breaking into her house and stabbing her to death with a kitchen knife. For nearly 2 years, the crime went unsolved. However, when Price committed another series of murders at age 15, the similarities to his earlier crime drew attention. This time, his victims were a woman and her 2 daughters, whom he killed in the same brutal way. This brutality prompted the involvement of the FBI, who profiled Peter as the suspect but failed to identify the teenager as a serial killer. Luckily, the breakthrough came when a local detective noticed Price with a suspicious cut on his hand, and after being confronted, he calmly confessed to all the murders. Initially, Price was tried and convicted as a juvenile, which under Rhode Island law at the time meant he would be released with a sealed criminal record upon turning 21. However, this decision was swiftly changed after Price bragged about his crimes and declared his intention to make history once freed. This action prompted public outrage and led to changes in Rhode Island's legal system, allowing juveniles to be tried as adults for heinous crimes. Unfortunately, these changes could not be applied retroactively to Price, as he was only sentenced to 29 years in prison. However, while in prison, Price still faced multiple charges, all of which eventually resulted in an additional sentence of 10 to 25 years. Just like Price, this next kid also did some brutal acts that landed him in prison. Evan Miller. Miller was a 14 years old who was arrested for the brutal killing of Cole Cannon in July 2003. It was reported that Miller and another teen, Colby Smith, planned to get Cannon drunk and rob him. Cannon was 52 and was a neighbor of Miller's family at Country Living Trailer Park. After getting their victim drunk, Miller and Smith stole baseball cards and $350 from Cannon. They then proceeded to beat him with a baseball bat and set his mobile home on fire. After they were caught, Miller was tried as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without parole. This made him the youngest person in Alabama to be sentenced to life without parole. However, years after his first sentence, Miller's legal team claimed that life without parole is cruel and unusual to impose on a 14-year-old child. They therefore appealed that Miller, as well as all other people who were convicted of capital murder as juveniles, be resentenced, and eventually there were. But here's the twist. While the judge agreed to their appeal, he did not give Miller a lesser sentence. Rather, he resentenced him to life without parole. The judge claimed that he found Miller as the principal offender who brought about the death of Cannon, adding that it was his reluctant but necessary conclusion that Miller be resentenced to life without parole, since it was the only just sentence in this case. Miller's resentencing was deemed necessary by many, and just like him, this next kid also received the same life sentence. Nicholas Cruz. Nicholas Cruz was born on September 24, 1998, in Florida, and was adopted at birth by his foster parents. He is said to have had behavioral issues since preschool. However, this problem became global after he perpetrated the Parkland High School shooting on February 14, 2018. This incident is regarded as the deadliest mass shooting at a high school in US, at a history majorly because of the fatality involved. Nicholas, who was 19 years old at the time, opened fire on students and staff at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, killing 17 people and injuring 17 others. A CCTV footage was later discovered showing how Nicholas made his way into the school premises before kick-starting his shooting spree. After the massacre, Nicholas fled the scene on foot by blending in with other students, but he was eventually arrested approximately 1 hour, 20 minutes later in Coral Springs. On October 20, 2021, Nicholas pleaded guilty to all charges, and while a jury unanimously agreed that he was eligible for the death penalty, they were unsure of whether it should be imposed. Since the death penalty was inconclusive, Nicholas was eventually sentenced to life without parole on the 2nd of November 2022. He was also made to listen to the heartbreaking words of his teacher.
You don't know me, but you tried to kill me. I will have a scar on my arm in the memory of you pointing your gun at me, ingrained in my brain forever.
While Nicholas had a known psychological problem, This next kid allowed a momentary flip to land him in trouble. Dylan Shoemaker. Dylan Shoemaker was probably a loving boyfriend, but surely not a caring stepdad and babysitter.
I didn't mean to kill Austin. Ashley, I really didn't. I really think I did that. I didn't mean to hurt him.
On March 19, 2013, 16-year-old Dylan Shoemaker called 911 to report his girlfriend's 23-month-old baby, Austin Smith, as unresponsive. Upon arrival, the emergency immediately sensed that there was more to the story than Dylan had claimed, and they would soon find out the shocking truth. According to prosecutors, Smith was beaten on the head several times by Shoemaker. They claimed that he allegedly muffled the boy's face with a pillow before striking him 3 times while trying to get him to stop crying.
But there were other dynamics at work there, including my client's inability to either control his anger or frustration and his inexperience in babysitting.
Based on his short life now, what is to say he won't do this again?
Dylan was 19 years old when he was sentenced in January of 2014 for the murder of baby Austin Smith. He was given the maximum punishment of 25 years to life in prison when prosecutors proved the intent was truly to murder. However, this sentence was later modified to 18 years after appeals were made in the court system. While Dylan probably acted on impulse, this kid was fully aware of his crime and the trouble he was getting himself into. Aidan Fucci. On May 9, 2021, Aidan Fucci murdered Bailey, a 13-year-old middle schooler. Bailey was reported missing by her family that morning, and her body was later found with 114 stab wounds. Fortunately, a residential surveillance camera had recorded Bailey walking around with Fucci at 1:45 a.m., and another recording also showed Fucci running alone with his shoes in hand. This discovery led investigators to visit Fucci's house to search for evidence, and there they found bloody clothes in his room and in the bathroom sink. Also, a knife with a fragment of the tip missing was found in a pond near Bailey's body, and the missing knife tip was later found embedded in the victim's scalp. Fucci was eventually arrested on charges of Tristan Bailey's murder. On March 24th, he was charged as an adult and was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
Mr. Fucci, having entered a plea of guilty to the crime of first-degree murder, I adjudicate you guilty of the premeditated first-degree murder of Tristan Bailey. I sentence you to life in prison. Because of your age, you are eligible for review of the sentence in 25 years.
During his sentencing, the judge said he took into account several factors when making his decision, including Fucci's young age and the heightened level of premeditation. He also noted that Aidan was considered of average maturity by his peers and that he understood the consequences of his actions. Just like Aidan Fucci, this next kid was also a sole participant in a devastating crime. Mackenzie Sherrill. On July 31st, 2022, at approximately 5:30 a.m., Mackenzie Sherrill, who was 17 at the time, was driving her Toyota Camry with 2 male passengers inside, her boyfriend and his friend. It was reported that she drove at a controlled speed for some time before accelerating her vehicle to 100 mph. Sherrill then drove her vehicle directly through a business sign and into a building. The crash site was eventually located 45 minutes later by an individual who then called the police. When police arrived, both male passengers were pronounced dead at the scene, while Sherrill was taken to a nearby hospital and treated for her injuries. However, after further investigation of the car's black box, it was revealed that Sherrill had her right foot pressed down on the acceleration pedal to its full extent, and the service brake pedal was also never applied before the impact. So clearly, Sherrill's vehicle had no defects that contributed to the crash in any way. Sherrill was later found guilty of murder for purposely causing the car crash and was sentenced to 2 life sentences for the murders, with both to be served concurrently. Many pleaded that the judge order the sentences to run consecutively and that Sherrill spend the maximum sentence of 30 years instead of life in prison. However, the prosecution argued that Sherrill had no remorse for her actions. There were also videos of her going to concerts and college parties after the wreck, an act that mother excused as her way of getting over the grief. Similar to how Sherrill brutally ended the life of a loved one, these next kids also did something despicable. Aaron Guerrero and Sierra Halseth. Sierra Halseth and Aaron Guerrero were sentenced to life in prison after they pleaded guilty to 9 counts, including murder with a deadly weapon and first-degree arson. The teenage girl and her boyfriend admitted to fatally stabbing the girl's father and setting his Las Vegas home on fire. Halseth's burnt body was found in the garage of his home on April 9, 2021, and it was reported that he was stabbed and cut 70 times. It was also reported that prior to this discovery, both Sierra and Aaron had purchased a circular saw blades, bleach, lighter fluid, disposable gloves, and drop cloth from stores near Halseth's home. They had also withdrawn hundreds of dollars from one of Halseth's bank accounts. After police arrested the couple, investigators found a video on Sierra's phone showing herself and Aaron giggling and admitting to killing someone.
I don't know what to say.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel. After earning Day 3 after murdering somebody.
Although Sierra claimed that her father abused her physically and sexually, the court did not consider that an excuse for her actions. As scary as it is for a girl to stab her dad, this next kid also stabbed his friend in such a brutal manner. Austin Myers. In 2014, Myers, alongside his friend Timothy Mosley, murdered Justin Back at his family home in order to steal a safe from the house. Myers and Back were allegedly friends until the 8th grade, when Myers moved to Clayton and attended Northmont High School. However, it was this same Myers who decided to target Back's home, unknown to him that the family safe contained only $70 at the time. It's said that Myers took 2 days to prepare, including acquiring septic chemicals that he expected would help decompose Back's body after the attack. On the day of the incident, Myers and Mosley went to Back's home. Myers knocked on the door, and Back let the pair inside. The 3 boys allegedly talked for a while, and afterward, Back went to the kitchen. Seeing that Back wasn't looking, Mosley attacked him from behind and attempted to strangle him, while Myers held Back from the front. While Back fought against them, Myers was able to place the garrote around Back's throat, while Mosley stabbed him in the chest, killing him. During the investigation, it was discovered that the duo stabbed Back a total of 21 times. Mosley pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also testified against Myers, who was eventually sentenced to death.
The pain and loss felt by Mark and Sandy Bates, and by Jake and Back, Justin's brother. I have brothers and sisters myself. I can only imagine what it would be like to lose one of them. I'm sorry that this happened.
It could be said that the stories of these kids are both saddening and scary. While there were kids who arguably suffered undeserved sentences, there were also others who laid the groundwork for their unfortunate end. But what do you think? Were these sentences appropriate, considering the age of the perpetrators? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section.